Welcome to Old World Order Theology with Brian Newberry. Today's topic, can Christians be revolutionaries? Very fitting topic right now. Coincidentally, going across the encyclicals of Pope Leo XIII, we kind of come upon this topic at a convenient time since as we speak today on June 9th, 2020, there have been a series of protests and riots in the streets over the death of George Floyd by a police officer, and a lot of people are angry because there is a continuance of black men being killed and injured by police officers in this country, or at least, it is true, but the media seems to kind of instigate it and sometimes over-exaggerate it as if other people are also not injured and killed by police officers. So in any case, there are a plethora of demonstrations and sometimes violent rioting, and even the talk of dismantling entire police departments in various cities, which just sounds like anarchy. So the question is, can a Christian, being a representative of Jesus Christ, participate and endorse these kind of radical protests and these radical demonstrations, or not so much demonstrations, these actions and revolts against proper order, as if governments were not put in place by God. And of course, if you've been following this channel, I keep referring to Romans chapter 13. Now, in Jesus' time, there were a group of Jewish revolutionaries called the Zealots, and they wanted the yoke of the Roman Empire, the pagan Roman Empire, thrown off of them so they could be free and independent like they were under the previous monarchs of Israel. But did Jesus endorse the Zealots? No, he did not. In fact, one of the 12 apostles was Simon the Zealot. He was a former zealot, and he became an apostle of Jesus, and he ceased being a zealot. If you remember, when Jesus was arrested and was questioned by Pontius Pilate, when Pilate asked him if he were a king, it was in John chapter 18, I believe verse 36. And Jesus says, "I am a king. My kingdom is not of this world, though. If it were, my followers would be taking up the sword to have me freed." And then after Jesus died and resurrected and ascended into heaven, did the church establish itself in violent revolution against the pagan Roman Empire? No. Mind you, the Christians were persecuted fiercely off and on for the first 300 years of their existence, and they never once endorsed or promoted violent revolution against the Romans. In fact, they prayed for their enemies. They refused to worship the emperor as a god. They refused to even offer him incense. They protested. They resisted, but they did not seek violent overthrow or a dismantling of the Roman Empire. There's nothing in the early writings that demonstrates that was their mindset. Now, so what happened? How did the empire become Roman? Well, when the Emperor Constantine the Great had the vision of the cross in the sky, he had a religious conversion. So I know some doubt this, but if you do your history, the conversion was genuine. You might not agree with all of his methods afterwards, but he was not. His conversion wasn't complete, you might say, until much later in his life. He was still figuring things out, and he was the head of state. The head of state has certain responsibilities, and especially being the commander of the military, he fought battles against other would-be emperors. They were competing for the crown, as you were. And Constantine began to shift some of the policies which were formerly anti-Christian. In fact, the Edict of Milan was an edict to tolerate Christianity, to not persecute them, which was good. The Christians loved that. And then eventually he began to legislatively dismantle the pagan system, and eventually it gave way to his successor, Theodosius, who officially made the empire a Christian empire. So that put men who were Christians in high places in government, and then they resumed the responsibility of government. So the conversion of the Roman Empire was not done from a bottom-up revolution. It was actually a top-down revolution. God, in his sovereignty, being the master of history, he converted a leader, and through his leadership and through his administration, he shifted the pagan empire into a Christian empire. There was no anarchy, there was no violent revolution. Now, as Americans, we have the natural tendency to support revolution because obviously our country was founded on revolution against the British Empire, and the British Empire at that time especially was pretty ruthless, and you could say it was just. And during that time period in the 18th century, the late 18th century, there were a series of revolutions going on. And not many years later, in 1789, you have the very extremely violent French Revolution, where they were beheading Catholic priests and nuns in the streets, beheading monarchs and aristocrats in the streets. That was a revolution much more violent and much more anarchic than the American Revolution. And the French Freemasons instigated that event. And then later you have the communist revolutions of the 20th century with the Bolsheviks, and then Chairman Mao in China and other places where violent revolution were staged to overthrow the government from the bottom up. So the question is, can a Christian be a revolutionary? So I'm going to be reading an encyclical from Pope Leo XIII. It is fairly lengthy. I'll try to get through it quickly. I'll stop and make comments when it's deemed necessary. This is from the encyclical Immortale Dei, November 1st, 1885. So what's going on in 1885? There are various socialist revolutions fermenting in Europe. This is not only but a couple of decades after the Civil War in the United States of America, where you have kind of, in a way, revolutions from both the North and the South kind of going against each other. So revolution is in the air, right? So this has to do with the Christian Constitution of States, Immortale Dei. Pope Leo XIII, quote, "And so God has partitioned the care of the human race between two powers, namely ecclesiastical and civil, the one, to be sure, placed over the divine, the other over human affairs." Close quote. So what do we have there? We have church and state. And Pope Leo XIII, in line with Catholic tradition from the very beginning, Romans 13 and up, says that the church and the state are both established and partitioned by God. So the state takes care of civil matters, the church takes care of ecclesiastical matters, and they're not to be separate in essence. They're only separated or partitioned in function and in responsibility. Continuing, quote, "Each is highest in its own order. Each has its certain limits within which it is contained, which are defined by the nature of each and the immediate purpose. Therefore, an orbit, as it were, is circumscribed within the action of each takes place by its own right." Quote, close quote. So Leo XIII is granting, as the vicar of Christ on earth and the visible head of the church, he is granting that the state has its rights. It takes care of the things that are proper to it according to nature. So if you remember Romans 13, some of the functions of the state that St. Paul lists are the rewarding of the righteous and the punishing of the wicked, and to collect taxes. Just as Jesus said, you render unto Caesar what belongs to Caesar, and unto God what belongs to God. Ultimately, everything belongs to God, but there are separate functions. Continuing, quote, whatever then in human things is in every way sacred, whatever pertains to the salvation of souls, or the worship of God, whether it is such by its own nature, or again is understood as such because of the purpose to which it is referred. This is entirely in the power and judgment of the Church. But other matters, which the civil and political order embraces, are rightly subject to civil authority, since Jesus Christ has ordered, the things that are Caesar's render to Caesar, the things that are to God's, God. Matthew 22:21. But occasions sometimes arise when another method of concord is also efficacious for peace and liberty, namely, if rulers of public affairs and the Roman Pontiff agree on the same decision in some special matter. On these occasions, the Church gives outstanding proof of her motherly devotion, when, as is her wont, she shows all possible affability and indulgence. Close quote. So it's saying here that the most efficacious means for peace and liberty is when the Church and the state agree. So ultimately, it is God's will and proper that church and state are not separate in their essence, only in function, and ultimately, the church and the state are supposed to be parallel. They're supposed to be going in the same direction. Ultimately, the salvation of souls should be its chief aim. Yes, we have material needs. Yes, we need to have a good economy. We need to have jobs so that families can provide for their children and their households. We need to have militaries to protect and defend borders against foreign enemies. And we need to have police forces to protect against domestic enemies, criminals. We need to have all these things. We need to have the material means to live in a way that is pleasing to God. But if the aim is not the salvation of souls, and there's only one way that could happen, through the Lord Jesus Christ, through the means that he gave to his bride, the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, if that isn't the chief goal, then it's all for naught. What does it profit a man to gain the whole world only to lose his soul? Continuing, quote, to wish also that the Church be subject to the civil power in the exercise of her duties is surely a great injustice and a great rashness. By this deed, order is disturbed, because the things that are not of nature are put over those that are above nature. Close quote. So he's saying when the state desires to be superior over the church and tries to subject the church and subordinate the church underneath the state, he says order is disturbed. So if you don't have a state that is properly subordinated under the church with the chief goal of the salvation of souls, you're already starting off on the wrong foot. It disturbs order. Continuing, quote, the frequency of the blessings with which the church would fill everyday life, if she were not hampered by anything, is destroyed or certainly greatly diminished, and besides, a way is prepared for enmities and contentions. And what great destruction they bring to both powers. The issue of events has demonstrated beyond measure. Such doctrines, which are not approved by human reason and are of great importance for civil discipline, the Roman pontiffs, our predecessors, since they understood well what the apostolic office demanded of them, did by no means allow to pass uncondemned. Thus Gregory XVI, by the encyclical letter beginning Mirari Vos, on the 15th day of August 1832, with great seriousness of purpose, struck at those teachings which even then were being preached, that in divine worship no preference should be shown, that individuals are free to form their own judgments about religion as they prefer, that one's conscience alone is his guide, and furthermore that it is lawful for everyone to publish what he thinks, and likewise to stir up revolutions within the state. Close quote. So what are these ideas that the former Pope Gregory the XVI condemned. Let's go through them quickly, because not quickly. Let's stop and pause, because these are important. And some of these will go against the ideas of the founding fathers of the United States of America, which is not surprising since a great deal of them were Freemasons, and Freemasons being enemies of the Catholic Church. So, first of all, what is the first error? That divine worship, there should be no preference for divine worship. Basically saying that everyone has the right to worship in their own way as they see fit. That actually goes against the first commandment, and it goes against the principles of the Bible. So in the Old Testament, when you read Leviticus, it gives specific instructions by God how he wanted the Israelites to worship him. The liturgy is important. So what happened to the sons of Aaron when they burned the incense the wrong way on the altar? God killed them. Liturgy is important. Worship is important. So the freedom of religion, as the American documents understand it, and as most of the Western liberal democracies understood it, is actually anti-Christian. I know that's a tough pill, tough pill to swallow for a lot of us, but nevertheless, it's true. Next principle, that individuals are free to form their own judgments about religion as they prefer. That kind of goes along with the first. It's still a violation of the first commandment. God is the one who grants rights, and God would never grant you the right to do something that is contrary to his nature and contrary to his commandments. He gives you the right to choose. You have free will, but it's not a right, as in a virtue. So when we talk about rights, it usually has to do with virtues. God permits a person to choose religions, but he's not happy about it. That's not a principle that comes from him. Next one, that one's conscience alone is his guide. So those who are naturalists would believe that God gave us a conscience and that's good enough for us to decide. So what that does is eliminate special revelation. It eliminates the sacred scriptures. It eliminates the church as having any authority over the individual, because after all, their conscience is their guide. It's kind of like the enemies of the church which would be the liberal Catholic priests and bishops. They would say, yeah, officially the church teaches against artificial birth control, but ultimately it's up to your conscience. So when you go to confession, they might not even tell you it's a sin, which is an error, a great error. Next one, and that it is lawful for everyone to publish whatever he thinks, and likewise to stir up revolution within the state. So basically with the printing press, and now even much more so with the internet, the Catholic Church had condemned the right for free publication of propaganda, which would stir up revolution. So the church is all about orderliness according to both natural and divine law. So these ideas, which actually began with Martin Luther in 1915, the famous quote, if you cannot correct my ideas with the scriptures, according to his own conscience, then he wasn't going to be convinced. He might not have realized what he was doing, but nevertheless, the results that came about, you could say that Martin Luther is the father of modern liberalism, because he thought he had the right to judge religion as he saw fit. He thought he had the right to read the Bible, and if it so disagreed with church doctrine, then according to his conscience, then so be it. Okay, continuing. Quote, on questions of the separation of church and state, the same pontiff writes this: we could not predict happy results both for religion and for the civil government from the wishes of those who desire that the church be separated from the state, and that the mutual concord between the civil and ecclesiastical authorities be broken off. For it is manifest that devotees of unhampered freedom fear that concord, which has always been beneficial and salutary for both sacred and civil interests. Close quote. So Pope Gregory the XVI said that both the civil authorities, the civil structure, and the church structure both benefited the most when they were both in concord, both going the same direction and not separated. But those who want unhampered freedom or licentiousness, decadence, those who are into wickedness, they don't want the church and state going in the same direction. They want them to be at odds, so they could choose one or the other whenever it's convenient to them. Yeah, that's not consistent or reasonable. Continuing, quote, in a not dissimilar matter, Pius IX, as opportunity presented itself, noted many of the false opinions which began to prevail, and afterwards ordered the same to be gathered together, so that in it were a great sea of error, Catholics might have something to follow without mishap. Close quote. And there he's referring to the syllabus of errors, and I've done a video on that, so if you want to check my channel for the syllabus of errors and Pope Pius IX, you could see what errors he referred to. Continuing, quote, moreover, from these precepts of the pontiffs, the following must be thoroughly understood, that the origin of public power should be sought from God himself, not from the multitude. Close quote. That's so important. Public power comes from God. It does not come from the multitude. It is not bottom up. Democracy, more than one doctor of the church. You can go with St. Robert Bellarmine, St. Thomas Aquinas, and others. All said that democracy is the worst form of government because people will vote favors for themselves. They will fatten themselves with benefits, and eventually society will become disordered, and an oligarchy or a dictatorship will emerge to straighten out the mess and to put things back in order. And it's usually very oppressive. So public power comes from God. It comes from the top down, not the bottom up. Continuing, quote, that free license for sedition is at odds with reason, that it is unlawful for private individuals, unlawful for states, to disregard the duties of religion or to be affected in the same way by the different kinds of religion, that the unrestricted power of thinking and publicly expressing one's opinion is not among the rights of citizens, and is by no means to be placed among matters worthy of favor and support. Close quote. That's a handful there. So, the free license for sedition is at odds with reason, is what is being said here. And he's going by what some of the things Pope Pius IX said. So sedition being revolution, right? That you're not free to revolt against the government according to reason here, and obviously against the scriptures. Also that it is unlawful for private individuals and for the states to disregard the duties of religion. So secularism is against reason, and secularism is against God. So secularism and culture cannot coexist, because look at the word culture. What is the root word of culture? The root word of culture is cult. What is a cult? It's not, like those wacky cults that, make everybody drink the Kool-Aid. That's not what the proper definition of a cult is. Cult just means religion. So if a culture is void of religion, then it's actually non-culture. It's not really even a culture. Secularism destroys religion, and it destroys a society, because human beings, all studies of anthropology across the world show that human beings are naturally religious. They actually have to be conditioned to be secular. Human beings have a natural affinity for God because God placed that in our hearts. He's the creator. Why would he create us without a longing for religion? So when you get rid of religion, you're asking for disorder, and revolution will happen. Continuing. I forgot one thing. The unrestricted power of thinking and publicly expressing one's opinions is not among the rights of citizens. So we might say, what about free speech? Notice what he says here. He says unrestricted power of thinking. So he's not against free speech. He's just saying it does need to be regulated. So if your free speech is causing and promoting sedition, if it's promoting revolt against proper authority, then that is not a right granted by God, because God doesn't want you to revolt against proper authority. There is a grievance process that is peaceful and just, that can be pursued by citizens of a country when an injustice by their authorities have occurred. And that's the route that ought to be pursued. Continuing, quote, "Similarly, it should be understood that the Church is a society no less than the state itself, perfect in its kind and its right." Close quote. That's important to understand. The Catholic Church has always taught that the Church is a perfect society. Doesn't mean that the people in it are perfect. It says the society, as far as the way it is ordered and structured, is perfect because God has established it. Jesus Christ himself is the one who established the church. So it has to be perfect and orderly because Jesus is God, you see. So it is not less than the state. That's an error. Continuing, quote, "And those who hold the highest power should not so act as to force the church to serve and to be under them, or so as not to permit her to be free to transact her own affairs, or so as to take from her any of the other rights which have been conferred upon her by Jesus Christ." Close quote. So here we're saying that the rights of the church were conferred by Jesus Christ himself, the rights of the church. So the church is not to be placed under the state. It is not to serve the state by the whims of the state. So, for example, a great tragedy here in America is the fact that it is reported 40% of the income of the American bishops come from government grants, which is a conflict of interest. So what that means is whenever the government suggests that the church take a course of action, what is the church going to do? It's going to obey its patrons. Can't do that. So, for example, when this Wuhan coronavirus came out, the states ordered the churches to be closed down, and what did the church do? It folded, it bent the knee, because it knows where its money's coming from. And it's a tragedy. So the sacraments were denied to the faithful, the sacraments being the ordinary means of salvific grace, and the church bent the knee to the state and obeyed. And even afterwards, when many of the churches wanted to open back up, whether it be Catholic or Protestant churches, some of the governors were saying, no, the church cannot be opened back up, even though the abortion clinics were open, and the liquor stores were open, and the marijuana shops were open. So something's wrong here. What do we have? We have disorder. We have revolution on our hands. So let us continue. Where was I? Quote, "However, in matters of mixed jurisdiction, it is wholly in accord with nature, and likewise in accord with the plans of God, that there be no separation of one power from the other, but plainly that there be concord, and in this manner befitting the closely allied purposes which have given rise to both societies." Close quote. So separation of church and state, heresy. See my other videos on the matters of church and state. I've done quite a few so far because I'm going through the encyclicals of the popes in the 1800s, and they are dealing a lot with revolution and the attempted separation of church and state, secularization, Freemasonry, and then a little bit of socialism and communism is beginning to emerge also by this time. So that is why the popes are really laying down the hammer, as they should, against these errors and heresies being propagated by the revolutionaries. Continuing, quote, "This then is what is taught by the Church on the establishment and government of states. However, by these statements and decrees, if one desire to judge rightly, no one of the various forms of the state is condemned in itself, inasmuch as they contain nothing which is offensive to Catholic doctrine, and as they can, if they are wisely and justly applied, preserve the state in its best condition." close quote. So he's saying that the church is not going to choose what is the best form of government, whether it be a republic, a democracy, even though the church has made the opinion that democracies are the worst form of government. But it's not going to say that it forbids a country to be democratic if it so wants to be. If it's an aristocracy, or even if it's a monarchy, the church is not going to say, it's not going to dictate to the state what kind of state it should be, insofar as it does not offend Catholic doctrine and rule justly and wisely to preserve the state in its best condition. So if the state is not promoting the common good, if it's not promoting its best potential, if it's purposely being unjust and oppressive, and it's purposely making laws that are contrary to Catholic doctrine, then the church has the right to say this is a wrong form of government. So, for example, if the state redefines marriage as something other than between one man and one woman, if it promotes polygamy, if it promotes same-sex marriage, if it promotes something else, the church has the right to say that is unlawful for the state to do, and as it does. So yeah, most Western countries are in error in that sense. Or if the state says that a woman has the right to murder her unborn baby via abortion, or take an aborticide pill, Plan B, and so forth, if the state says that it is legal and just to do that, the church has the right to say that is unjust and that should not be lawful. The church has that right. Continuing. Open quote. Neither, by any means, is this condemned in itself that the people participate more or less in the state. This very thing at certain times and under certain laws can not only be of use to the citizens, but can even be of obligation. Close quote. So it's saying forms of government that have a lot of citizen participation, like voting and such, civil duties, that can be of great benefit. Or if you have a monarchy where the citizens are less involved, or a republic where representatives are chosen to vote and make decisions, that's okay too. Quote, furthermore, neither does there appear any just cause for anyone charging the church with being lenient or more than rightly restricted by affability, or with being hostile to that liberty which is proper and lawful. Indeed, if the church judges that certain forms of divine worship should not be on the same footing as the true religion, yet she does not therefore condemn governors of states who, to obtain some great blessing or to prevent an evil, patiently tolerate custom and usage, so that individually they each have a place in the state. And this also the church especially guards against, that anyone against his will be forced to embrace the Catholic faith. For as St. Augustine wisely advises, man cannot believe except of his free will. Close quote. So the church does permit the state to tolerate non-Catholic religions, because if that brings about more peace, we don't want to have a series. If you have a non-Catholic nation and you don't want a series of religious wars and burning heretics at the state, because that does not promote the public good. It's different when you have an established Catholic state and then you have seditions and revolutionaries trying to make the state not Catholic. That's a totally different situation. But in a situation such as America, where you have a mixed pot of religions, the government has the right to say that the other religions, the non-Catholic religions, have the right to exist for the sake of peace and the common good. And the Catholic Church also goes along with that. Not that a person has the right to choose a wrong religion, but that for the common good, it's tolerated. So, you go your way and we'll go our way and we'll have common peace. Ultimately, the desire of the Church is that all men be converted to the Catholic faith. But as Pope Leo quotes St. Augustine, it must be of man's own free will. Continuing, quote, In a like manner, the Church cannot approve that liberty which begets an aversion for the most sacred laws of God and casts aside the obedience of due lawful authority. Close quote. So, liberty that defies lawful authority, which would include the President of the United States, the Supreme Court, Congress, the Senate, police. Note it says lawful, meaning when they are unlawful, then there are means of grievance, right? So the Church does not promote that kind of liberty. Continuing, quote, "For this is more truly license than liberty, and as very rightly it is called the liberty of ruin by Augustine and a cloak of malice by the Apostle Peter, 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 16. So in 1 Peter it says that we should pray for the emperor, even the pagan emperor, and to obey lawful authorities. Continuing, quote, "Rather, since it is beyond reason, it is true slavery, for whoever committeth sin is the servant of sin." John chapter 8, verse 34. On the other hand, that liberty is genuine and to be sought after, which, from the point of view of the individual, does not permit man to be a slave of errors and passions, most abominable masters, if it guides its citizens in public office wisely, ministers generously to the opportunity for increasing means of well-being, and protects the state from foreign influence. This liberty, honorable and worthy of man, the Church approves most of all, and never ceases to strive and to struggle for its preservation sound and strong among the nations. In fact, whatever is of the greatest value in the state for the common welfare, whatever has been usefully established to curb the license of rulers who do not consult the people's good, whatever prevents the highest authority from improperly invading municipal and family affairs, whatever is of value for preserving the dignity and the person of man and the quality of rights among individual citizens. Of all such things, the records of the past ages testify that the Catholic Church has always been either the discoverer or the promoter or the protector of these things, close quote. So that's a mouthful there. So the state does not have the right to establish laws that bring people into slavery of the passions. So, we agree that owning other human beings as if they were livestock or property is wrong. And also, even worse than that, is when you become a slave of sin and the passions. So, true liberty does not permit the state or man to pursue freedom that will enslave them. So, for example, pornography enslaves the man, slaves to human being, because now women are getting into pornography, watching it too. Pornography enslaves a person into their lusts, and it disorders their mind about what sexuality is all about. And it objectifies the person, a human being, especially a woman, as a sex object, and it really wreaks havoc on a society. Just one example. There's plenty of other examples. And also that the rulers themselves do not have free license to pursue their own interests. The purpose of a person in authority, the purpose of their authority is to serve those who are under their authority. A bad example of authority is when a person uses their authority to pursue their own goals, their own ambitions. So that's a bad use of authority. And as Pope Leo says, the Catholic Church has always promoted the idea of proper authority and proper laws, which do not bring about slavery to sin. Continuing, quote, "Therefore, always consistent with herself, if on the one hand she rejects immoderate liberty, which for individuals and states falls into license or slavery, on the other hand she willingly and gladly embraces the better things which the day brings forth, if they truly contain prosperity for this life, which is, as it were, a kind of course to that other life which is to remain forever." Close quote. So the Church is not against prosperity, it's not against wealth, but the purpose is to the other life which remains forever, namely eternal life. So the goal is still eternal life. In the meantime, if people are successful, if they're talented and they're able to make a lot of money, then it's a good thing. Because how do we help the poor other than having an abundance. And no, it doesn't say that the state has the right to redistribute the wealth. It just says that persons are able to have prosperity. Continuing, quote, therefore, when people say that the church is envious of the more recent political systems and indiscriminately repudiates whatever the genius of these times has produced, it is an empty and groundless calumny. Indeed, she does repudiate wild opinions. She does disapprove nefarious zeal for seditions, and expressly that habit of mind in which the beginnings of a voluntary departure from God are seen. Close quote. So the church disapproves of seditions and revolutions where the people are voluntarily departing from God. So obviously the church has to repudiate that, and wild opinions. So, yeah. Continuing, quote, but since all that it is true must come from God, she recognizes whatever has to do with the attaining of truth as a kind of trace of the divine intelligence. And since there is nothing of truth in the natural order which abrogates faith in teachings divinely transmitted, but many things which confirm it, and since every discovery of truth can lend force to the knowledge and praise of God, accordingly, whatever contributes to the extension of the boundaries of knowledge will always do so to the pleasure and joy of the church. And just as is her custom in the case of other branches of knowledge, so will she favor and promote those which are concerned with the investigation of nature. So, close quote. So the church is not against science. It is not against scientific inquiry. It is not against the pursuit of science, because nothing in true science will ever contradict what has been divinely revealed to the church. So all truth is God's truth, in other words, and it ought to be pursued. Continuing, quote, in these studies, the church is not in opposition if the mind discovers something new. She does not object to further investigations being made for the refinements and comforts of life. Rather, as an enemy of indolence and sloth, she wishes especially that the talents of man bear rich fruits by exercise and cultivation. She furnishes incentives to all kinds of arts and works, and by directing through her influence all zeal for such things towards virtue and salvation, she struggles to prevent man from being turned away from God and heavenly blessings by his intelligence and industry. Close quote. So the church is not against arts or works of man, not against architecture, cultivation, hard work. So the building up of civilizations, the church endorses that because that comes from God. But it must work towards virtue and salvation. And these things actually, if done with virtue, will bring a man closer to God. It will not make him go away from God. Secularism does not work to these ends. And cultivation is actually the opposite of revolution. Revolutionaries want to tear down what has already been established and replace it with something artificial of their own imaginations, their own sinful imaginations. Cultivation is building on top of what has already been established. Like a farmer adding another layer of soil on top of other soil, right? Or a building on top of a foundation already established. These revolutionaries today, they think that, we've been doing it wrong for centuries and centuries and centuries. Now it's time to take our planet back, as the United Nations has so boldly proclaimed. Time to take our paganism back, basically, is what they're really saying. It's really just saying the old pagan Roman Empire, which was defeated by the church by peaceful means, they want their planet back. And there is a revolution to re-establish that. And they are merely midgets standing on the shoulders of giants, telling the giant that he was wrong and they need to go in a different direction. That's all it is. Continuing, quote, and so in such a difficult course of events, if Catholics give heed to us as they ought, they will easily see what are the duties of each one in matters of opinion as well as of action. And indeed, in forming opinion, it is necessary to comprehend and hold with a firm judgment whatever the Roman pontiffs have handed down, and shall hand down, and to profess each publicly as often as occasion demands. Close quote. So the Catholics need to obey the popes insofar as they are teaching what has always been taught and has been handed down. The Roman pontiffs are not to teach new things, especially if they contradict what has been handed down. Continuing, quote, and specifically regarding the so-called liberties so sought after in recent times, it is necessary for everyone to stand by the judgment of the Apostolic See and to have the same opinion as that held by it. One should not be deceived by the honorable appearance of these liberties. One should consider from what sources they derived, and by what efforts they are everywhere sustained and promoted. Close quote. So, if someone's promoting, we want freedom, we want liberty, what are the sources of their ideas? If it comes from bad philosophy, such as the Enlightenment philosophy, the philosophy of the Freemasons, then we are to condemn those kind of liberties. And by what efforts are they being promoted? Meaning, what are the means which are being used to establish them? Is it violent revolution? Is it protests against proper governing authority? If that's the case, then we are to condemn these kind of liberties being sought after. If the goal is to separate away from the church and away from God, it's wrong. Continuing, quote, it is well known from experience what results such liberties have achieved in the state, for everywhere they have borne fruits which good and wise men rightly deplore. If such a state really exists anywhere or is imagined in our thoughts, which shamelessly and tyrannically persecutes the name of Christian, and that modern kind of state be compared with it, of which we are speaking, the latter may well seem more tolerable, yet the principles upon which it relies are certainly of such a kind, as we have said before, that in themselves they should be approved by no one. Close quote. So if a so-called liberty persecutes the name of Jesus Christ and his followers, even though it might seem like it is a tolerable form of government, it should be disapproved by the faithful. Quote, however, action may be concerned with private and domestic affairs or public affairs. Certainly in private affairs, the first duty is to conform life and conduct most diligently to the precepts of the gospel, and not to refuse to do so when Christian virtue exacts something more than ordinarily difficult to bear and endure. Furthermore, all should love the church as their common mother, keep her laws obediently, promote her honor, and preserve her rights, and they should try to have her cherished and loved with equal devotion by those over whom they have any authority. Close quote. So the first duty of the citizen is to conform their lives and conduct the precepts of the gospel, and never refuse to do it even when it's hard. That's what it's saying. And to preserve the rights of the church and submit to the authority of the church. Continuing, quote, it is also in the public interest to give attention wisely to the affairs of the municipal administration, and in this strive especially to effect that consideration be given publicly to the formation of youth in religion and in good conduct, in that manner which is right for Christians. On these things especially does the safety of the individual states depend. Close quote. So it also should be sought in the state to promote the formation of the youth in religion. So teaching children religion is something that is good. It promotes order and harmony in the state. So when we cease to teach our children proper religion, it's just breeding them to choose to replace religion with something else, and that will eventually lead them to be deceived and to embrace revolution. Continuing, quote, likewise, it is in general beneficial and proper for Catholics to extend their attention further beyond this, as it were, rather restricted field, and to take in the national government itself. We say in general because these precepts of ours apply to all nations, close quote. So it's saying that Catholics should actually seek to be involved in government and to run for office and so forth. And Pope Leo XIII is saying that the principles spoken of here in this encyclical, these apply to all nations. So they're not giving one favor to one nation or the other. And the Catholic Church being the universal church established by Jesus Christ, when she teaches on a matter, it applies universally in all nations. Continuing, quote, "But it can happen in some places that it is by no means expedient for weighty and just reasons to take part in national politics and to become active in political affairs. But in general, as we have said, to be willing to take no part in public affairs would be as much at fault as to have no interest and to do nothing for the common good, and even more because Catholics, by the admonition of the very doctrine which they profess, are impelled to carry on their affairs with integrity and trust. On the other hand, if they remain indifferent, those whose opinions carry very little hope for the safety of the state will easily seize the reins of government. And this also would be fraught with injury to the Christian religion, because those who were evilly disposed toward the church would have the greatest power, and those well disposed the least." Close quote. So it is saying that, you've heard those people saying, "Oh, I don't get involved with politics. It's so divisive. I'm just going to be spiritual and pray and be a faithful citizen." And some people are called to do that, and that's fine. But when the majority of Catholics have that mentality, it actually does great harm to the state, because then the people who get into power, who run for office, are actually anti-Christian, and they want to put laws that contradict the law of God, and that is exactly what has happened in Western civilization over the last 60 years, especially since the 1960s, because they were pursuing pleasure and the easy road rather than taking the hardships of being a leader. So it does injury not only to the civil society, it does injury to the church too, because then the influence of the church wanes and the state becomes bigger, and socialism and revolution emerge. Continuing, quote, "Therefore, it is very clear that the reason for Catholics entering public affairs is just, for they do not enter them, nor ought they to do so, for this reason, so as to approve that which at the moment is not honorable in the methods of public affairs, but to transfer these methods, insofar as it can be done, to the genuine and true public good, having in mind the purpose of introducing into all the veins of the state, as a most healthful sap and blood, the wisdom and virtue of the Christian religion." Close quote. So the purpose of getting into public office is to promote the virtues and the wisdom of the Christian religion, so namely Catholicism. So the purpose is much like how the Roman Empire was converted to Catholicism in the 4th century via the leaders from the top down putting certain laws into place that were in concord and were parallel with the law of God. That should be the goal of the Catholic entering office today. The goal of the Catholic is not to get into office to contradict the law of God, and we're going to get into that right now. Quote, "Lest the union of souls be broken by rash charges, let all understand the following, that the integrity of the Catholic faith can by no means exist along with the opinions which border on naturalism and rationalism, the sum total of which is to tear Christian institutions from their foundations and to establish man's leadership in society, relegating God to second place. Likewise, that it is not lawful to follow one form of duty in private life and another in public. For example, so that the authority of the church is observed in private life and cast aside in the public life. For this would be to combine the honorable and the shameful, and to place man in conflict with himself, when on the other hand he should always be in accord with himself, and never in anything or in any matter of life abandon Christian virtue." Close quote. You've seen these Catholic politicians, Joe Biden, Nancy Pelosi, Cuomo, governor of New York. They'll say, "I'm personally against abortion, but publicly I support it." That's just nonsense. It's saying that you're combining the honorable and the shameful, and you're actually dividing yourself as a human being. You're not being consistent. If the Catholic Church is against abortion because it murders a baby, so you can't say, "I personally against murdering babies, but publicly I support murdering babies." That's just nonsensical, and it's evil. And also note it says that the Catholic cannot exist. The opinions of the Catholic faith cannot coexist with naturalism and rationalism. And I've talked about those ideas in length in other videos. basically saying that, oh, we can only judge by what can be proven by science and what can be proven by logic. So any supernatural order or supernatural laws cannot be permitted in the state. That's nonsense. The Catholic has the obligation to uphold the law of Christ first and foremost. All right, closing. Quote, "But if there is question merely of methods in politics about the best kind of state, about ordering government in one way or another, surely in these matters there can be an honorable difference of opinion. Therefore, a dissenting opinion in the matters which we have mentioned on the part of those men whose piety is otherwise known, and whose minds are ready to accept obediently the decrees of the Apostolic See, cannot in justice be considered a sin on their part. And a much greater injury takes place if they are faced with the charge of having violated or mistrusted the Catholic faith, which we are sorry to say has taken place more than once. Let all who are accustomed to express their opinions in writing, and especially writers for newspapers, bear this precept in mind. In this struggle over the most important matters, there can be no place for internal controversies or for private rivalries, and all should strive to preserve religion and the state, which is the common purpose of all. If, therefore, there have been any dissensions before, they should be obliterated by a kind of voluntary oblivion. If hitherto there have been rash and injurious actions, those who are in any way to blame for this should make amends with mutual charity, and a kind of special submission should be made on the part of all to the Apostolic See. In this way, Catholics will obtain two very excellent results. One, that of establishing themselves as helpers of the Church in preserving and propagating Christian wisdom, and the other, that of bestowing upon civil society the greatest blessing, the preservation of which is imperiled by evil doctrines and passions." Close quote. So closing, the Church says there can be difference of opinions on the methods of how to implement Christian virtues and laws, and there is not to be such a polarizing division within political parties that they cease working for the common good and they are just attacking each other. Although, unfortunately, sometimes there are political parties which have the express purpose of being antichrist and going against the law of God. Because it says that we should all be striving to preserve religion and the state. We should be striding to promote church and state in concord and going in the same direction, not to be separated, and not every man for himself according to his own conscience. Because we are to use mutual charity toward one another, and we are to submit to proper authorities both in the state and in the church, namely the Apostolic See. That is what a society should be. So those who are trying to promote evil doctrines and the passions of the flesh, those who are trying to promote hedonism and pleasure at the cost of all else and against God, that needs to be nipped in the bud. That needs to be put to death by the church and the state. That is how a society exists. So therefore, a Christian cannot be a revolutionary. Here at Old World Order, we are counter-revolutionary. We are trying to reestablish Christendom where the church and the state go together, separate in function, common in purpose. God bless you. In nomine Patris, Filii, Spiritus Sancti. Amen.